Podcast 411, Item 231. Today's guest is Lou Mongello, host of the WDW Radio Podcast.
Podcast411.com. Listen different.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Rob, and this is the Podcast 411 Podcast. In this episode, we will have an interview with Lou Mongello. After the interview, I'll get you some additional podcasting news and where I'll be going and speaking, so please stick around after the interview. As always, your feedback is greatly appreciated. Give us a call, 206-666-4357. That's 206-MOM-HELP. Or send an email to podcast411@gmail.com. And now, on to the interview with Lou Mongello. Here we go. Lou, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thanks for helping re-kickstart Podcast 411 here with new interviews. It's been too long.
Yeah, I agree, man. And thank you. I appreciate it. Hopefully after this one, they still keep on listening. So,
yeah. So I'll start you with the traditional. I'm going to keep the traditional first question. What was your first computer? Do you remember?
My first computer, I had one of those. Oh my gosh, I don't even remember. It was one of those little sort of pocket computers. It was it was basically like just a big calculator. But my first sort of real computer was a Tandy TRS-80.
Which one did you have? Mod 1, Mod 3, or, oh, God forbid, the Mod 2, or was it the Coco?
I had the big honking one with the 12-inch floppy disk drives that didn't really do very much.
That was a Mod. That would have been Mod 3, I believe. Yeah. I actually had that for one. That was one of the ones I had back in my days. But yeah, that was one big solid unit with the drives off. I think it was off on like the right side, and that was an interesting computer.
Yeah, it had a cassette player. Like you stored data on a cassette player.
Yes. Oh, that was so much fun. I mean, when we graduated to floppy drives from cassettes, we were like, oh, this life is so good.
And when you notched the other side and were able to use both sides, that was like a big hack.
Discovering the hole punch. That
right.
Yes, you could use the hole punch to put that notch on the other side, and you just doubled your disk storage space was the greatest thing when you were, yes. Absolutely.
We'll never fill up this floppy. Who needs more floppy drives? We'll never fill these up.
My wife hates my pack rat nature because I still have I have a big box full of floppy drives. They probably don't even work anymore in our storage. So for my Atari 400, so I still have the 400. Someday I'll break that out to the kids and say, this is how you used to program. Let me tell you about assembler. What was the first podcast you listened to?
You know what? I might have to say my own because I started in 2005, and I had a buddy of mine who was a tech nerd as well. And we were talking about this new medium, and we both had websites, and we said, let's learn more about this and give this thing a try. I don't even know if I listened to one first before we just sort of dove in and started recording.
Was yours the first Disney podcast?
I don't think it was the first, but it was probably when I started, I think there was maybe 2 or 3 other ones that were out there.
And you were blogging about Disney before that. How long were you blogging about before you did the podcast?
So I started my site in 2003, maybe early 2004, and I started podcasting. I think my first episode went up in August of 2005.
Well, so good timing right after iTunes launched. Yep. You live in a really good place to do a Disney podcast.
I didn't always. I used to live in New Jersey, which is not a good place to. It's a good place to get bagels, not a good place to do a Disney podcast. So I eventually ended up moving down here just because the commute was killing me.
How long ago did you move down to Orlando?
So I moved actually to South Florida for a couple of years in 2008, and I've been in Orlando for just over 6 years.
I just took my family to our first Disney trip. This was my 4th time to Disney, but my kids my son turned 10 while we were there, older one, and then the other one was 7 just before he turned 8. So I think that was a really good age for them, and they had a blast. Like many, I was not well prepared. We stayed in Riverside. We never made it back to any of the evening festivities, just because the kids were so exhausted.
Yeah.
So I think a lesson I learned on this one was next time I think we're going to do Polynesian and be on the monorail so we can run over at night.
It definitely helps. And the thing about Disney that's unique is that I think unlike any other destination, in order to really maximize your experience here, you really do need to plan ahead of time. If you're like, just get a hotel and we'll wing it when we get there, that's kind of a recipe sometimes for disaster, depending on how flexible you are, because you do need to sort of have a little bit of knowledge ahead of time and a little bit of a game plan before you get here.
It sounds like things are changing with the Fast Pass and how that works. And how do you stay on top of it? I mean, do you get any special announcements? Do the Disney PR people go, "Hey, Lou, we got some new stuff we want to tell you about"?
No, I mean, I work with the PR team, but I don't get anything exclusive. Usually, now and Disney was very sort of late to the game in starting their own blog, and believe it or not, they don't have a podcast. So usually if they're going to break something, they will release it themselves, and then they'll have maybe a media event or anything like that. And if I do discover something, or I have some friends who are in the company, or if I learn something, I never reveal that ahead of time. That's just not my place to do it, to sort of be a spoiler and release the secrets. I let them sort of do it on their own, and then I will go and talk about it after.
You started 11 years ago for your podcast, and I know you do feedback on your show. I hear from podcasters a lot. How do you get feedback? What's your secret? What do you do to initiate getting feedback? Any recommendations on that?
Well, I mean, really, it from the beginning, it happened organically. People just felt compelled to either comment on something, or the thing about Disney, too, is we all, to a certain degree, have somewhat of an emotional connection to Disney. So if I talk about an attraction or a show or a memory, sometimes it'll spark something in somebody and they feel maybe compelled to share their story as well. But I always include a single call to action at the end of my segment. So I want to hear from you. What's your favorite place to have breakfast? What is your favorite attraction? Whatever that simple thing is, to give them a reason to comment, and then give them very easy ways to, submit that feedback, whether it's voicemail or social.
And speaking of 11 years of feedback, is there some common theme? I mean, what are some of the most common questions you get from listeners?
A lot of it revolves around food, because I am, this body didn't happen naturally. I am a big food guy. So I love talking about food. And that really is such an important part of the experience. But the beautiful thing, Rob, is that in 11 years, I've never repeated a topic. Most of the questions I get from listeners are not necessarily repeats. Maybe, I'm going for my daughter's birthday. What's something special that we can do? They really do run the gamut, because the listeners, the audience, ranges from young kids as, 8, 9 years old, 10 years old, emailing me, to their 85-year-old grandparents.
Is there any email that sticks out in your mind, like some of the best ones, that like most touching, or just, some feedback that really is memorable to you?
I say this to podcasters all the time, in that you never know who's listening, right? And what I mean by that is there's sort of different sides to that. You never know who's listening. You never know what sort of opportunities may come to you as a result of your podcast. But you also never know how what you do or what you say might affect somebody. And I always, look to do things to positively affect other people. And I think sometimes we don't realize how, look, I do a show about, Disney World and rides and foods and really happy things, but I've gotten emails, and there's one specifically that sticks in my head that says, hey, I've been a Disney fan since I was a kid, and there was this young girl who got very sick, and she had cancer, and she was in the hospital. I get choked up every time I tell the story. She was in the hospital, and she was bedridden, had vision problems for months. And she said, I just sort of went back and started listening to your show from the beginning, and you helped get me through it. And when you hear that, man, you think that you're talking about something as simple as the topic at hand, Disney World and food and rides, and you don't realize the effect that had on somebody. And she says, I listened to the entire time, and it helped me get me through the treatment and the rough times and all that kind of stuff. I've gotten a couple of them like that, and it really sort of hits home for me.
I can see why you would pick that. And you do keep up all your episodes?
I do.
That's nice. So people can go back and listen and learn. And the 451 episodes as of today. It's
crazy, man. And what's funny? It's 451, not including the year and a half I did of the other show, and not including, I used to do like a weekly live video broadcast, and I would extract the audio and make that like a newscast and videos. So I don't know how many episodes are actually in the feed, probably closer to 1,000. But when somebody says, hey, I just found your show and I'm going back to show number 1 and I've listened to them all, that's insane. I mean, not in a good way, but it's insane that that's a lot of Lou, man. That's a lot.
It's not like Game of Thrones where they can go back and listen to 50 episodes and they're done.
It's one thing to talk about Game of Thrones, but when somebody's talking about something that you create, your time is your most valuable commodity. So the fact that somebody is willing to spend and share some of that going back and look, man, how anybody listened after episode 1, which was 6 minutes of pure torture, I have no idea. But it's very, very humbling when somebody says something like that.
Yeah, a lot of people will I took down like my first 30 episodes. My first 30 episodes on 411, they technically were just bad. Just because I was trying to figure out how to record Skype interviews. I mean, I did everything from having a digital recorder on the other side of the microphone, and coming off the speakers, and it was and using what did I had a phone where I was doing it on a speakerphone. It was some really bad early setups. But those people that are starting today, they have it a little bit better. There's actually tutorials that show you how to do stuff. We didn't have all that luxury.
I know, we're going to sound like a couple old men here, but I mean, it's true. I mean, we were sort of figuring it out as we went along, and we were hand coding our RSS feeds and figuring out what an RSS feed was and how people were going to find it and how they were going to listen to it. When I put up my first episode, and I really had no idea what to expect. And, when like 250 people were downloading, I'm like, I can't believe that there's 250 people out there that love Disney as much as I do, and they're taking the time and they found it somehow. So it's really been an incredible journey, sort of watching how this has all evolved.
From the podcast, you must have been invited to a few special events because of that. Any one that you think was like, wow, I'm so glad I'm doing this podcast because I would not be here at a specific event because of it?
I mean, there's a lot. I mean, there's a ton of things that, look, I'm a Disney fan first. I do this show because I love this place and I love being able to talk about the things that make us happy about it. So getting invited to cruise, when they launch a new cruise or out to Disneyland. But I'll tell you, man, the very first time I got invited to a Walt Disney World media event really was a game changer for me, because for years I was sort of gently, politely knocking on the door saying, hey, I just want access. I don't want anything for free. I just want access to information. I'm writing these books. I'm doing this show. I want to make sure that it's accurate. And they said, look, unless you are radio, TV, or newspaper, you're not media. Now, again, this is 2003, 2004. They didn't even know what the word podcast was. And I kept, knocking on that door when I finally got my first invite, and I'm standing at an event and at a red carpet next to major media outlets like USA Today and CNN and all these sort of, that was incredibly validating to me. And I've always been grateful and respectful of that privilege. And that was really, that was sort of a game changer that day.
Since you do a Disney podcast, I'm going to nail you down on this. Favorite ride?
So I'm going to give you a recovering lawyer answer. So,
come on, pick one. You have to pick one.
There's something timeless and classic about the Haunted Mansion that has remained pretty much unchanged for decades, and that would probably be it.
Okay. Again, we just went. My kids, unanimous. I think the family was all about Test Track. Test Track.
Oh yeah.
My wife and I, we have motion sickness. So while the kids also, I think their next favorite was the Star Tours. But we both got off of that going like, oh, this is going to be a long day. We're green. And yeah, definitely only went on the Mission Space green. Definitely, we're not going orange.
Right. Not every attraction is for every person. So.
Yeah. I did torture them through It's a Small World. And my oldest son turns to my wife part of the way through and goes, we wasted a fast pass on this?
But it's a rite of passage, right? You have to do it. You have to say that you've done it.
That's what I said. I said, Henry, I go, someday, somewhere, you're going to hear, someone's going to say something. It's a small world after all, and you're going to remember this, and the song's going to click, and it's going to be meaningful. And I go, you have to do this at least once. And I go, someday you'll have kids, and you will torture them with this, just right. Like my parents tortured me with this 30-something years ago. I go, so yeah, deal with it. You have won a couple or a few podcast awards. I'll put that in quotes. You've done pretty well with the podcast awards over the years. I mean, obviously, you've got great interaction with the audience. Any advice to folks about interaction with the audience?
So I think the first thing I would have to say is I would have to clarify what you said and correct you respectfully. I did not win that award. We won the award. And what I mean by that is the podcast awards is not about me or the show. It really is about the community of people that goes out and votes. I will tell you that I never asked to be nominated, right? The community went out and then they did it. So they made the initial nomination happen. They are the ones who band together, that remind each other, that put it out on social, that go and take the time to vote every single day. So the award really is in recognition, not of me and the show, but in them. And I really have always been about community since day one, since before I had a podcast and I had a V-Bulletin discussion forum. It was really sort of nurturing that community. And when you do that, and when you treat, I don't like the word fans. You've heard me say this in the past. I don't like the word fans. When you treat your fans like your friends, they become incredibly loyal, and they will become your most loyal evangelists. And the podcast awards is really just a testament to that.
Do you have a community now? Is it Facebook, Google Plus, a forum board? Is there a community that you have that's active outside of the podcast?
Yeah, they do. And they exist. They used to exist on a discussion forum. Eventually, I had to make the difficult decision to close it down because, of social media and so many other destinations that grab our attention. The community right now, I think, really exists in a few different places, which is fine because I think we sort of create content in the way that people are most comfortable consuming it. So they do exist on Facebook. And I think really the core of the community, I've been live broadcasting video weekly since about 2007. And that really, they sort of came up with, they call themselves the box people because they live in that little box on my desk. And they are sort of the core, I think, of the community because they don't just listen to the show and they don't just interact and they email, but they show up every week and they know each other and they've met each other in person. And you extend that into, live meetups every month and events and things like that. So I try and reach and engage the community in as many different locations as possible because unfortunately they're not just limited to the forums.
You say you do live video, and what is your setup technically when you do a show? I mean, what is your setup? How are you recording? Because you have guests. How are you recording everything?
So I've done it really two different ways. Oftentimes I will just be in my office, just using a webcam I went through a lot of different trials of different software. I started in 2007 with Ustream, not even knowing who would listen or who would watch, and I was amazed that anyone actually spent the time to watch me sit in my office. But I've gone from Ustream to Livestream to Meerkat to Periscope, and I went in really early on Facebook Live. They gave me access back in September, and I've just been blown away, not just by the quality, but by the engagement. And really, I went all in pretty quickly on Facebook. And I'll tell you, man, my setup is very simple. It's either a webcam or from my desk, but oftentimes I'll just be doing it from my phone. And the nice thing, too, is because I live so close to Disney, I'm able to take them with me and bring them to the parks or bring them to a restaurant so that I can connect them not just to me, but really to the experience itself.
Do you have a remote mic you use? Anything specific, or are you just using your smartphone?
I'm just using my smartphone.
Sweet.
Because of what I do and where I do it, people want to hear the ambient audio in the background, right? They want to hear the people. They want to hear the music. They want to sort of have sort of a multi-sensory connection to the environment, not just in what they see, but what they hear.
Talking about ambient background now, I nailed you on the favorite ride. Now I'm going to get you on the favorite restaurant.
Oh, come on, man. It's like picking my favorite kid. Gosh. There's actually a restaurant in the Walt Disney World Dolphin, which is so far off so many people's radar, but it's Todd English's Blue Zoo. And it was a life-changing meal. And I've gone back for years, and it's consistently some of the best food I've ever had, not just in Disney World, but like on planet Earth.
And if you want to find more of your best restaurants, I'm sure you've mentioned many others in past episodes. And where can people go to find your podcast, by the way?
So the podcast is at WDWRadio.com.
What have you done over the years to generate revenue from the podcast?
So, generate revenue was never really part of the initial plan. It sort of happened accidentally. I started doing, little affiliate stuff. And I'll tell you, man, again, quick story. Everything changed for me one day with one phone call. The phone rings at my house. Somebody says, hey, I'm from so-and-so company. I've been listening to your podcast for a few months. I love what you do. I'd love to sponsor it. What do you charge? And I sat there in dumbfounded silence because I had no idea what she was talking about. I'm like, wait, you want to pay me to do what I'm already doing just because I dig this anyway? And I stalled for time. And I says, let me put together a proposal and I'll get back to you. And I was like, well, now what do I do? How do I figure this out? So to answer your question, I monetize through a number of different ways. I monetize through a very limited number of sponsorships on the show. I have a number of products. I do books. I do audio tours. I published a print magazine. I gave live tours for a time in the past. I do live events. So there's a lot of different ways that I sort of look at it as a hub and spoke that, the podcast is at the center of my universe, and there's all these other spokes off of it that help me monetize the content.
And is the podcast your full-time job now?
Yeah, it has been since about 2008.
I always love hearing when people say that it's their full-time job. Now, don't get into podcasting, think it's going to be your full-time job. You got to remember, it's a small percentage, but it can happen. Having your full-time job be your passion and hobby, that's got to be nice.
It's what I think we all should strive for. And I will tell you, man, I feel bad, and I try and help people when I hear them go, oh, man, I hate my freaking job. I hate getting up. I hate my boss. But I love coming home and working on X. And I think being able to find what that thing is that you love. And, I know the word passion is thrown about, but I believe you need to be passionate about it. Find the thing that you're passionate about and somehow turn it into your career. I mean, I think unlike when maybe we were kids or our parents, we have the tools and opportunity to do that if you've got the drive and the hustle.
What's coming up in the Orlando world?
Well, the neat thing about where I am and what I do, and the reason why I've been able to talk about this topic without repeating it, for 11 years is because it's an ever-changing, ever-evolving ecosystem. The parks are not a museum. There's always something new coming up, so there's always new content. For me as a content creator, and obviously for the people who are listeners. So the fact that Disney is always changing makes my job a lot easier because there's always something on the horizon.
A couple more questions here. And one would be, what advice for podcasters about promoting their show? I mean, what have you done recently? I mean, you mentioned the Facebook Live. It seems to be working, but any other tips and tricks on the promotion side?
So believe it or not, man, this goes back to my philosophy since day one. I've never really taken out any kind of advertising. I've done no real sort of paid marketing. It really comes from the people who are already listening. So every single week since show number 1, I have asked people, hey, if you like the show, do me a favor. Please help spread the word. Tell your friends. Because look, if there's one thing for me or a brand to go out and say how great their product or their thing is, it's something else when someone else says, hey, you're a Disney fan, I've been listening to this podcast for years, you got to go and check it out. And I call it the Fabergé effect, as long as we're making old references, right? They tell 2 friends and so on and so on. And that's really how it's been built. It has been completely organic because of the people that listen and enjoy it and want to share it with others. And when it comes from a trusted source, like a friend like that, I think it carries a lot more weight than any kind of ad that I could place.
It's funny, whenever I talk to the larger shows like yours, word of mouth marketing always seems to be the answer. Create good content and your audience will tell their friends.
And it flies in the face of traditional sales and marketing. Yes. I get it, because it's not an overnight thing, right? This is a very much of a long-term play. So if you're looking for the quick hit, this is not way to do it. But I think growing organically, you'll have a much better long-term result than you will if you try and sort of game the system and just because the numbers don't matter, right? And I know, again, this flies. I never pay attention to my numbers, man. Like, stats don't mean anything to me. I pay more attention to the people who are already listening rather than the ones that, I've got you. Let me go and try and get some more people. Because if you love and you nurture those people, they will go out and grow the numbers for you.
Oh, come on. You sneaked a peek at your lips and stats now that you moved over, right?
Well, now that I've moved over, I mean, it's, what you have back there is pretty slick. So
we have people that will literally check their stats every hour. And it's like, come on, please get a life. Work on your show. Stop looking at your stats.
Stop paying attention to the numbers.
Yes. One piece of advice to a new podcaster starting out today, it doesn't even have to be Disney, but it can be specifically to a Disney podcaster because there's quite a few Disney podcasts out there. But one piece of advice for a new podcaster.
Man, it's hard to get it. This is where the recovering attorney in me comes out, because I want to give you like 6, because
you can give 6.
Again, we use the word, and I think maybe sometimes overuse the word passion, but I do a show, man, that I want to listen to. And when you do that, you will become a magnet for the kind of people that you want to attract. Don't go out there saying, oh, cupcakes are hot right now, I should go out and do a cupcake podcast. Do the show that you want to listen to. You will attract the audience that is like-minded like you, and be consistent. Consistency, I think, is really, really key. This is a marathon. It is not a sprint.
Lou, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, man. I really do appreciate it. You've always been very kind to me over the years, and I'm really happy to see the show back.
Again, thanks to Lou for coming on the show and talking about his podcast, WDW Radio, which you can find at WDWRadio.com or searching on iTunes for WDW Radio. And I'll have links in the show notes for episode 231 over at podcast411.com to his show. Speaking of podcast411.com, since the last episode, I put up a blog post titled, Hey Podcasters, What's in Your Wallet? And it's about the importance of having a business card for your own podcast, especially for those going to Podcast Movement this week or any other events in the future. Make sure to check out that blog post. And of course, I will be at Podcast Movement. Very excited to be getting inducted into the Podcaster Hall of Fame. Thank you, everyone, for all your support over the years. Couldn't have done it without any of you. And I do have a new tux for the event. The wife will be coming to Chicago for it as well. She'll be there on the 6th to see me get inducted in. I'm very excited about that. And I even have a very special bow tie one of my Today in iOS listeners made for me. Look for the pics on the Podcast 411 site after the event. Hope to have a few blog posts up on podcast411.com during Podcast Movement. And speaking of podcast411.com, if you go there and click on the speaking link, you will see all the future events, plus many of the past events I have spoken at. And I will be speaking again at Podcast Movement. I am on 2 sessions. The first is a solo session titled, Yes, That Marketing Advice for Your Podcast is BS, where I cut through a lot of the BS that's passed as advice from quote-unquote marketing gurus, and how to promote your show and how to monetize your show and other stuff they say. Anyway, I get to what really does matter and what definitely does not work and what does work. The session is Friday, July 8th at 10:15 a.m., The second session I am in is a panel session on the state of podcasting, also on Friday the 8th, and it's at 2:30 p.m. We will, talk about the state of podcasting. After Podcast Movement, I'll be speaking in Washington, D.C. on July 16th at the Blogging While Brown Conference, giving a Podcasting 101 and 201 session, and then a breakout Q&A session afterwards. I hope to see some of you there in Washington, D.C. On July 20th, I'll be speaking for the 10th year in a row at Kansas Fest, the Global Apple II Conference, and I will be speaking about iOS and watchOS and tvOS and all those good things. August 6th and 7th, I'll be speaking at the Elite Man Conference in Plymouth, Mass. My session is titled Standing Out from the Crowd with Podcasting, and it is a session that goes over the power of podcasting and how you can use it to really break away from those just blogging or with little to no online presence. September 23rd to 25th, I'll be at the LA Podfest in Los Angeles, California. And then in mid-October, the 13th to 15th, I'll be speaking at the Society of Adventist Communicators Conference in Denver. Again, I have a link in the show notes for these speaking events. And if you are going to any, please say hi and let me know ahead of time. And of course, if you have an event you need someone to speak at about podcasting, let me know. Please make sure you subscribe to the feed. That's the other podcast I do every other week. We have an episode of the feed, and every other week we have an episode of Podcast 401. So go to thefeed.com, thefeed.libsyn.com to get to that show, thefeed.libsyn.com. Elsie and I will cover podcasting news and a little bit more about the podcasting industry, not just the 1%, but all of podcasting. As always, if you have any feedback about Podcast 411 or podcasting in general, give us a call, 206-666-4357. That's 206-MOM-HELP. Or send an email to podcast411@gmail.com. Until the next time, I'm your host, Rob, from Podcast 411, reminding you to listen different. This podcast is proudly hosted on Libsyn.com. If you'd like to learn more about podcast hosting, go to Libsyn.com. That's LIBSYN.com, as in Liberated Syndication. Find out more about podcast hosting, podcast monetization, podcast promotion through smartphone apps, as in iOS, Android, and Windows Phone. plus many other features including Unpublished at Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, WordPress, Google Play, Spotify, and others. Plus our new destination stats. Again, go to Libsyn.com, and if you use a promo code podcast411, you'll get the rest of this month free and all of next month free.